A young nurse changed diapers for a millionaire CEO in Coma, but when he suddenly woke up, something. Step into the sterile corridors of Highgrove Private Medical Center, where the relentless beep of life support machines sets a tense rhythm, and every footstep echoes with hope or despair. In room 514 lies a powerful CEO who once ruled the business world, now trapped in a mysterious coma that baffles even the sharpest medical minds. Yet, amidst this maze of uncertainty, a young nurse makes a discovery that will flip everyone's expectations upside down, revealing dark family secrets, testing unbreakable loyalties, and sparking a life-altering bond that defies every rule. Brace yourself for a gripping journey of hope, betrayal, and impossible love in A Young Nurse Changed Diapers for a Millionaire CEO in Coma, but when he suddenly woke up, something. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to witness every twist and turn. The hushed corridors of Highgrove Private Medical Center carried a curious mix of sterility and quiet hope. Under the sharp fluorescent lighting, the floors gleamed with an almost unsettling brightness, as if daring every form of darkness to show itself. It was in this meticulously maintained environment, on the 5th floor, that an unspoken tension seemed to live in the air. Patients came and went, with some leaving on their own 2 feet and others never waking to see the next day. At the end of a long hallway stood room 514, an unobtrusive space that held a story far more gripping than the clinical decor might suggest. A mess of monitors, IV stands, and a mechanical ventilator surrounded the bed, creating a halo of machinery around a man named Elias Kingsley. Elias was no ordinary patient. He was the CEO of Kingsley Innovations, a multinational conglomerate known for everything from cutting-edge AI research to charitable endeavors that had made headlines worldwide. Before his accident, Elias had been the epitome of power and privilege. Lavish parties, appearances on major business networks, and a rumored net worth that could finance a small country made him a near mythical figure. Yet, in that bed, with tubes snaking across his body and monitors continuously reading his vitals, he seemed so heartbreakingly mortal. A horrifying car crash had placed him in a coma, and each day that passed without signs of improvement had caused even the most optimistic doctors to lose faith. Behind the mechanical chorus of beeps and whirs stood Clara Mendez, a 23-year-old nurse whose dedication far outweighed her years of experience. She was relatively new to the profession, just 2 years in, but her colleagues often remarked on her resolve to provide unwavering care. She was slender, with gentle brown eyes that shone bright whenever she smiled. Her hands, clad in disposable gloves, had changed Elias's bandages more times than she could count. She had also performed tasks even more personal, like changing his adult diapers, efforts few would volunteer for, especially given the social gulf between them. But to her, Elias wasn't a millionaire CEO to be awed by or used for personal gain. He was a patient, a person fighting a silent battle. Clara believed in the power of kindness, no matter how grim the reality. Each day she faithfully entered Elias's room and greeted him as if he could hear every word. She spoke to him about her life, the minor triumphs, the mundane frustrations, and even childhood memories that shaped her into the woman she had become. Many in the hospital staff wondered why she went to such lengths, especially for a man who, in their eyes, might never wake. But Clara's reasoning was simple. Just because someone was unresponsive didn't mean they couldn't feel compassion. In those early days, Elias's only companions were the repetitive drones of machines and the few personal belongings that hinted at his previous existence: a family portrait, a small plush toy from a niece, and a handful of fresh lilies regularly delivered from a private florist. No one came in to see him except for a weekly visit from a personal physician on the Kingsley Innovations payroll, paid to report any sign of recovery, no matter how minuscule, and occasionally an assistant who dropped off documents in hopes that Elias might, against all odds, suddenly rouse and sign them. Still, the largest presence in the room belonged to Clara, who took her vow of care to a level that made her stand out among her colleagues. Clara had chosen nursing partly out of a deep-seated empathy she couldn't seem to shake. As a child, she had watched her father battle a grave illness without the means to afford top-tier medical treatment. He passed away when she was 11, leaving Clara with a sense of injustice that blossomed into determination, as she grew older. She might not be able to save everyone, but she would make sure that each patient in her care felt seen, dignified, and important, whether they were the poorest among the poor or an unresponsive millionaire who once graced the covers of financial magazines. After losing her father, Clara and her mother struggled to keep afloat. Her mother, already fragile from heartbreak, began to show signs of chronic illness that worsened over the years. With limited resources, every day became a trial in balancing the cost of medication, rent, and basic needs. Throughout her formative years, Clara took on part-time jobs, from waitressing to tutoring younger kids, to help ease their financial burden. Even in the present, as a young adult, Clara's finances were precarious. Taking a shift at High Grove Private Medical Center had been a matter of practical necessity. The hospital offered a decent salary and flexible hours, plus the prestige of caring for high-profile clients meant occasional bonuses. But it also brought her face-to-face with an environment saturated with wealth that sometimes bordered on indifference. In room 514, Elias's condition required constant attention. The medical chart recorded daily that he was comatose with minimal chance of spontaneous recovery. The machines kept him alive, and the staff, including Clara, had learned to read their dials and monitors like second nature. Tubes delivering nutrients were carefully changed. Physical therapy, turning him to prevent bed sores, gently exercising his limbs, was done under Clara's watch. Perhaps the least glamorous part of it all was regularly changing his diapers to keep him clean and comfortable. Though the task was physically demanding and emotionally taxing, Clara performed it with meticulous care. She believed each moment of respectful handling was a quiet form of honoring a life that could not advocate for itself. On this particular Tuesday, Clara arrived earlier than usual, the crisp morning air still clinging to her scrubs. She stepped into Elias's room and paused, absorbing the steady hiss of the ventilator. The faint smell of antiseptics and disinfectants no longer bothered her. The staleness of the hospital had become a background note in her daily routine. Setting her bag aside, she pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and gently greeted her patient, as she always did. "Good morning, Mr. Kingsley," she said softly, moving aside the fresh lilies placed at his bedside. "I'm sorry if I'm a little out of breath. I missed my bus again and had to run the last few blocks. It's been a morning already, huh?" She positioned herself next to the bed, ready to start the sequence of checks and changes she had grown so accustomed to. While she worked, she sometimes told Elias stories about her life, how her neighbor played loud reggaeton music at odd hours, or how she was trying to pick up painting as a hobby. She had no illusions that he would miraculously reply, but it felt comforting to speak. In her heart, she hoped that perhaps on some level he might feel less alone. A sudden rustling at the door made Clara look up. In walked Cassandra Harrington, Elias's mother, whose demeanor radiated authority. Dressed in a sleek designer pantsuit, her silver hair was artfully arranged in an elegant chignon. She possessed the same striking blue eyes that Elias was known for, though hers carried a certain chill. Cassandra's presence in the hospital was rare. She typically dispatched lawyers, aides, or personal physicians to observe her son's progress. But every now and then she appeared unannounced, stepping into her son's room with an air that commanded immediate attention. Clara straightened up, momentarily caught off guard. She'd heard rumors that Cassandra had been pushing the hospital board to replace some of Elias's care team. The reasons were never officially stated, but Clara suspected that Cassandra found them, particularly her, unremarkable and beneath the status of the Kingsleys. Clara plastered on a polite smile and returned her focus to Elias, ensuring his pillow was adjusted to keep his head and neck supported. "How is my son this morning?" Cassandra asked, her tone clipped. She stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, scanning the room as if seeking a flaw to point out. Clara kept her voice steady. "No changes overnight, Mrs. Harrington. His vital signs are stable, and I'm about to begin his morning regimen." Cassandra's gaze fell on the supplies Clara had set out. Fresh linens, sterile wipes, gloves, an obvious sign that she was preparing to clean and change Elias. A flicker of distaste crossed Cassandra's face, which she masked almost instantly. "I see," she said coolly. "And the hospital felt comfortable letting you handle these tasks alone?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied, fighting the urge to sound defensive. "I've been specifically assigned to Mr. Kingsley's case because of my experience with long-term comatose patients. I also work closely with the lead physician, Dr. Patel, to ensure best practices in daily care." Cassandra's lips thinned. "Experience or no, I would prefer the most qualified staff for my son." She inhaled sharply, a hint of frustration swirling in her icy eyes. "It isn't personal, Miss Mendez. I just want to see if someone more specialized might be better equipped." Clara felt her chest tighten, but she maintained her composure. She had expected this conversation. "I understand your concern. I only ask for the chance to prove that I am fully committed to Mr. Kingsley's well-being. I've been monitoring every aspect of his care diligently." Cassandra shot her a look that wavered somewhere between skepticism and reluctant acknowledgement. She approached the bed, laying a manicured hand on Elias's motionless arm. For a moment, a crack formed in her rigid facade. A mother's grief flickered in her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by that austere control she wore like armor. "Fine," Cassandra said. "Keep doing what you're doing. But I will be evaluating the situation closely." With that, she spun on her heel and left, her expensive heels clicking on the polished tile. The door closed with a soft thud, leaving Clara exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She glanced at Elias, feeling a surge of empathy. Beneath the business empire and the pristine image, there was a family dynamic she knew little about. Clara murmured, "Don't worry, Mr. Kingsley. I won't let you down." Clara's day continued with the typical hustle of a hospital shift. She performed her rounds with meticulous care, checked vitals in adjacent rooms, and attended to minor emergencies. But her thoughts remained tethered to Elias. Something about her morning exchange with Cassandra felt like a warning. Clara couldn't shake the sense that she might be replaced by someone with more prestigious credentials or a fancier background. While she understood a mother's desperation, Clara also believed that consistent, compassionate care could surpass any resume lined with academic accolades. Late that afternoon, she returned to room 514. The warm glow of the setting sun streamed through the window, casting oblong patches of orange across the sterile floor. Elias lay unmoving, his chest rising and falling in the same steady rhythm as always. The beep of the heart monitor had become as familiar to Clara as her own breathing. She pulled up a chair near the bed and began to read aloud from a book she had discovered in a break room, an old paperback about overcoming trauma and the journeys people take to rebuild their lives. It seemed an odd choice for casual reading, but she thought the subject was uncannily fitting, given Elias's state. Halfway through a poignant chapter, Clara paused and set the book aside. Talking was second nature to her when she was in Elias's presence. "Mrs. Harrington visited today," she began softly, half wondering if Elias could sense the tension that had flared in the room. "I can see the pain in her eyes, but she's so guarded. It's almost like she wants to care for you but doesn't know how. I guess money doesn't buy everything, does it?" She reached out to brush a non-existent crease from Elias's sheet. The mechanical ventilator let out a soft sigh. Clara continued, her voice carrying a gentle warmth. "I wonder, Mr. Kingsley, what kind of person you were before all this. People say you were ruthless in business. Some say you were philanthropic. Others swear you were both. But I've learned that people are more than just what the media prints. I'd like to get to know the real you." A sudden flicker of movement in Elias's hand caused Clara's eyes to snap to his wrist. She froze, her heart quickening. Did she imagine it? Over the past months, she had witnessed small twitches, nothing more than the body's reflexes, the doctors had explained. Yet, something about this moment felt different. She leaned closer, scanning his fingers for the tiniest sign of voluntary motion. Nothing happened. The stillness returned, mocking her hopeful heart. She sighed, deciding that it must have been another involuntary spasm. But in that fleeting heartbeat, she sensed something, an almost imperceptible energy in the room. It pushed her to believe more fiercely than she already did that Elias was still there. Maybe behind the veil of his coma, he was listening, wanting to respond, fighting to reach out in any way he could. With renewed determination, Clara took his hand in her own, gently rubbing circles on the back of it. "I believe in you, Elias," she whispered. When everyone else has given up, I'll still be here. Over the next week, Clara took every precaution to support Elias's condition. She carefully documented every twitch, every subtle shift in muscle tone, any sign, no matter how faint, that might indicate increasing neural activity. She consulted Dr. Patel, the lead physician overseeing Elias's case, about adjusting therapy sessions to include more frequent limb exercises and gentle massages. If Elias's body was showing any hints of returning responsiveness, Clara wanted to encourage it as much as possible. Although Dr. Patel respected Clara's dedication, he retained a clinical skepticism. "Miss Mendez," he would say, scanning through charts of brainwave patterns, "I understand your optimism, but we have to be realistic. Elias suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. The probability of a sudden recovery after this many months is extremely low." Still, Clara refused to let grim statistics dampen her resolve. She remembered how her father's nurses often treated him as if he were a burden, speaking about him in hushed voices, as if he were invisible. That memory alone was enough to fuel her determination not to treat Elias the same way. During the hours she spent at his bedside, she didn't just do the job tasks. She played soft music, read aloud inspiring stories, and updated him on the daily happenings at the hospital. It was during one such visit, late on a rainy evening, that a remarkable moment occurred. Lightning flickered outside the window, illuminating Elias's still form in harsh, fleeting bursts. Clara had pulled the room's curtains halfway, allowing just enough view of the storm to feel its presence without scaring the rest of the ward with bright flashes of light. She had been recounting a humorous story about a new intern who'd accidentally spilled a tray of supplies in the cafeteria when she noticed Elias's finger move again. But this time, it was more pronounced, a definite curl of one finger that nearly pressed into the sheet. Her breath caught. Adrenaline spiked through her veins, and she nearly knocked over a nearby stool in her rush to examine him more closely. She pressed the call button for assistance, her heart pounding so loudly in her ears that she could hardly think. When another nurse and a resident doctor arrived, Clara demonstrated the movement, or at least tried to. By then the motion had ceased. The resident shrugged, scribbling notes that read, "Possible involuntary muscle response." Yet Clara remained convinced she had witnessed something else, volition, however faint. In the quiet after the small flurry of medical staff left, Clara knelt by the bed. "Elias, I promise I'm not going crazy," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "I know you tried to move just now, I saw it." The storm raged on outside, heavy raindrops pelting the windows, but a soft flicker of hope glowed inside her chest. If there was even a chance that Elias was fighting to come back, she would do everything in her power to help him. She stroked his knuckles gently, her eyes damp with a quiet determination. "I'm right here," she said, "and I'm not giving up." Word of Clara's observation spread slowly among the nurses, and while most dismissed it as a nurse's hopeful imagination, a few started paying closer attention to Elias during their shifts. Days rolled into nights, and nights merged into the faint light of dawn. The routine never wavered, vital checks, tube replacements, bed adjustments, but the growing sense of anticipation gave each action a heightened significance. Cassandra Harrington, meanwhile, had been preoccupied with a series of legal matters concerning Elias's business empire. Rumors circulated that some of Elias's own board members were beginning to doubt that he would ever wake, with quiet discussions about the future of Kingsley Innovations taking place behind closed doors. If Elias remained incapacitated, who would run the company? Cassandra, who was financially secure in her own right, seemed torn between the desire to preserve her son's legacy and the need to face an increasingly dire reality. On a Wednesday morning, clear and bright with sunlight streaming in, Clara entered Elias's room to begin her routine. She wore her usual pleasant smile, though in truth her heart felt heavy with doubt. She had started to question if perhaps she had imagined the finger movement. She approached the bed and greeted Elias warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Kingsley. It's a new day, and who knows? Maybe today will bring us some good news." She checked the monitors, ensuring everything was within stable parameters. The oxygen levels looked good, the heart rate was consistent, nothing out of the ordinary, at least by Elias's standards. Then she began to change his linens, a meticulous process that involved carefully shifting his body. As she removed the old sheets, Clara suddenly felt something graze her forearm. She froze, unsure if she'd bumped into something. Glancing down, she saw Elias's hand partially lifted as though trying to reach for her. Her breath caught in her throat. "Elias?" she whispered, barely daring to hope. Then, in a sequence that felt both painfully slow and impossibly fast, Elias's eyelids fluttered. Once, twice, and then they opened, revealing the same striking blue eyes that had once graced countless magazine covers. In that instant, the reality of the hospital room seemed to collapse around her. It was as if time held its breath. Her mind raced. Should she call a doctor immediately, or should she first verify what she was seeing was real? She gently touched his hand. "Mr. Kingsley," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "If you can hear me, can you blink or move your fingers again?" Those blue eyes flickered with something that resembled confusion, then slowly scanned the room. His mouth parted, but no sound emerged, just the shallow rasp of air struggling to form words. Clara felt a surge of relief so profound that tears sprang to her eyes. She pressed the emergency call button with shaking fingers, her pulse pounding so loudly that she could barely hear the blaring alarm she had just initiated. The impossible had happened. Elias Kingsley was awake. Chaos erupted in a matter of moments. The emergency response team arrived, led by Dr. Patel, who nearly dropped his stethoscope in astonishment. Nurses gathered in the corridor, craning their necks for a glimpse of the once comatose CEO, who had inexplicably opened his eyes. Technicians scrambled to adjust the monitors to new settings, verifying that Elias's vitals could sustain him outside a deep coma protocol. The lights in the hallway flickered as if acknowledging the significance of the event. Amid this swirl of activity, Clara stayed close to Elias's side, offering him what little reassurance she could. Though his muscles had atrophied and his voice was still non-existent, the flicker of awareness in his gaze spoke volumes. Dr. Patel and his team performed a rapid examination, pupil responses, reflex tests, scans of brain activity. The results showed a remarkable, though not yet fully understood, increase in neural responsiveness. Cassandra Harrington arrived shortly after, her expression a collision of disbelief and fierce maternal hope. For once, she didn't reprimand any staff member or question Clara's qualifications. Instead, she stood at the foot of the bed, tears shining in her austere eyes. "Elias," she whispered, inching closer until she could see the lift of his chest. "My God, you're really here." Through the rest of that day, the medical team adjusted Elias's care plan. They lowered sedatives, introduced specialized physical therapy, and scheduled frequent cognitive tests to measure his progress. A flurry of phone calls was made. Specialists from other prestigious medical institutions were contacted, hoping to glean insight into this unprecedented recovery. The hushed sense of tragedy that had once enveloped room 514 was replaced by a quiet hum of determination and curiosity. Clara found herself the reluctant center of attention. Some hospital staff congratulated her for her devotion, while others speculated that it was merely a coincidence. She received nods from administrators who'd barely acknowledged her existence before. Despite the sudden flood of credit, Clara remained humble, staying focused on the man now blinking at the ceiling, as if discovering a new world. When the rush finally calmed and the overhead lights dimmed for the evening, Clara was allowed a few private moments with Elias. She pulled up a chair, the adrenaline of the day still buzzing in her veins. His eyes, though weary, locked onto her. With a trembling hand, he tried to lift his arm. Clara reached out and clasped his fingers gently, tears threatening to spill again. "Hello," she said softly, struck by the weight of this simple greeting now that he was conscious. It felt surreal to speak to him and see him actually listening. No more one-sided monologues. "You're probably confused. It's okay. You're safe." His lips parted and a faint, hoarse whisper escaped. It was unintelligible, but Clara sensed he was trying to form words. She leaned in, her heart tightening with compassion. "Take your time, Mr. Kingsley," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." In that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. For months, Clara had cared for him in stillness, believing in a recovery when almost no one else did. Now, their world had irrevocably changed. Over the following days, Elias underwent a whirlwind of medical evaluations. Physical therapists arrived, carefully bending and straightening his limbs to combat the stiffness from months of immobility. Neurologists performed tests with shining lights and reflex hammers, analyzing each response. Dr. Patel seemed to grow younger by 10 years, animated by the extraordinary case he had on his hands. Meanwhile, the rumor mill churned throughout the hospital halls. A miracle at Highgrove, the man who woke when all hope was nearly lost. Clara felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. On one hand, she was deeply grateful that Elias had made this breakthrough, validating the faith she'd placed in him. On the other, she couldn't ignore the stirrings in her own heart. She had spent countless hours speaking to Elias in hushed tones, sharing her life story, her fears, her dreams. She knew more about him, at least in theory, than he knew about her, especially given his condition. But in those final days of his coma, she had sensed something intangible between them. With him now awake, she wondered what would remain of that connection. For his part, Elias navigated the ups and downs of early rehabilitation with grit that suggested the business titan was still alive inside him. Though speech came slowly, at first only soft, raw-sounding murmurs, he began to find words. The daily frustration of not being able to articulate his thoughts led to repeated attempts, sometimes accompanied by tears of anger. Yet, every time he trembled on the edge of giving up, Clara's gentle voice urged him on. When Cassandra was in the room, she tried to display unwavering support. She would comment on his therapy progress, coordinate with medical staff, and remind him that Kingsley Innovations awaited his triumphant return. But her presence also carried an undercurrent of tension. She insisted on controlling the environment around him, his meal schedule, the music that played in the background, even the visitors who came by. To her credit, Cassandra rarely confronted Clara directly now that Elias was improving, but the older woman's controlling nature stood like an invisible wall between them. "I want you to rest, Elias," Cassandra would say, smoothing invisible wrinkles in his blanket. "We can deal with company matters when you're stronger. I'm sure you have more important concerns at the moment." In a voice still raspy from disuse, Elias once managed a quiet objection. "But the company, my responsibility." Cassandra patted his shoulder without really acknowledging the spark of independence in his words. She nodded with pursed lips, as though appeasing a child who didn't yet know what was best for him. Outside of these moments, Elias's eyes often sought Clara as though she were a familiar anchor. Whenever she entered, his expression softened, and sometimes he managed a small smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Each time it happened, a flutter ran through Clara's chest. She told herself it was just relief at his progress. Yet a deeper part of her whispered that something else was forming, a tenderness that neither of them could yet name. Late one afternoon, after a grueling physical therapy session that left Elias exhausted, Clara stepped into room 514 with a small smile. She carried a tray with soup, crackers, and a cup of water thickened slightly for easier swallowing, a necessity during his early swallowing therapy phase. Elias had made a few jokes, in halting speech, about how he felt like a baby learning to eat again, but Clara had encouraged him, reminding him every milestone was a victory. As she helped him lift the spoon to his lips, their eyes met for a brief electric moment. In that gaze, the months of silent care, the nights she had spent watching over him, and the intangible bond they had forged all converged. Elias set the spoon down with unsteady fingers, managing to whisper, "Thank you for everything." Clara's cheeks warmed and she lowered her head. "I'm just glad you're doing better," she murmured, not trusting herself to say more. Without warning, the door swung open, revealing Cassandra Harrington in a high-collared coat that screamed designer elegance. Behind her trailed a pair of executive-looking men in suits, presumably board members or legal advisors. The tension in the air became palpable. Cassandra's gaze landed on Clara, then on how close she stood to Elias, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Elias," she greeted, stepping forward and placing a cool hand on his forearm. "I've brought Mr. Delgado and Mr. Brown from the legal team. There are some documents we'd like you to look over. Just regarding some administrative changes needed at Kingsley Innovations while you're recuperating. A formality, really." Elias frowned, his still recovering speech struggling to keep up. "Can talk later?" he asked, glancing at Clara. He looked overwhelmed, as if juggling the effort of speaking and processing the swarm of lawyers was too heavy a burden at the moment. Cassandra's eyes flickered with impatience. "The board is pressing for certain decisions, Elias. We need signatures and clarifications. You've been absent for a long time, and people are worried about the direction of the company." Sensing Elias's distress, Clara gently set the tray aside. "Perhaps it would be best if Mr. Kingsley had some rest before addressing business matters," she ventured, her voice steady but polite. Cassandra turned to face her fully, her expression cold. "Thank you, Nurse Mendez, but I'll decide what's best for my son." She nodded to the two men who stepped forward with a folder stuffed with paperwork. "Let's just get these done, shall we?" Elias shot Clara a pleading look. For a split second she wanted to protest, to shield him from the suffocating demands of his corporate obligations. But she was just a nurse, or so she reminded herself, and Cassandra was well within her rights to handle her son's affairs. So Clara simply offered Elias a supportive smile and retreated to the corner, silently promising she would be there if he needed her. Watching from the sidelines, Clara felt an undercurrent of frustration. Here was a man barely out of a coma, forced to wade into legal quagmires. Though she understood the stakes, it still felt wrong. A pang in her chest told her that perhaps she wasn't just feeling protective as a caregiver. She was feeling protective as someone who had, against all odds, come to care for him deeply. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her small studio apartment, replaying the scene between Elias and Cassandra in her mind. The swirl of legal talk, the pressure, the sense of Elias's vulnerability, it all made her uneasy. She thought back to the day she had first been assigned to Elias's case, how impersonal it had seemed. Patient is high profile, treat with utmost discretion. She recalled her earliest tasks, adjusting IV lines, monitoring vitals, ensuring bed sores did not develop. Then came the months of deeper care, physical therapy, reading aloud, even changing his diapers, all those intimate tasks that made him feel less like a case and more like a human being. Now that Elias was awake, a shift had taken place. He was no longer the silent figure she poured her heart out to. He was a breathing, thinking person, and apparently so was she. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the hiss of her nearby radiator, and admitted to herself that her concern for Elias went beyond professional duty. She felt an urge to protect him, to see him free of corporate shackles, at least until he could stand on his own 2 feet. Was that crossing a boundary? She didn't want to overstep, but she also couldn't deny what her heart was telling her. Morning came, and with it the beep of her alarm clock. Clara trudged to work with a heavy heart, bracing for another day of skirmishes with Cassandra. Upon arriving, she found Dr. Patel in the hallway, quickly jotting notes onto a chart. He looked up and offered a rare smile. "Good morning, Miss Mendez," he said, clearing his throat. "I was hoping to catch you. About Elias. His vitals are still stable, and I believe we can start more vigorous physical therapy sessions soon. You've done an outstanding job so far." She felt a wave of relief at Dr. Patel's praise. "Thank you, Doctor. I'm happy to keep supporting him in any way I can. Are there any concerns with, well, the pressure his family is placing on him right now?" The doctor's face grew serious. "Cassandra Harrington is a formidable woman, and I can't control her decisions. My job is purely medical, but I'll do what I can to ensure Elias's well-being remains the priority." Encouraged by his words, Clara proceeded to Elias's room. She found him awake, gazing out the window at the hospital's carefully pruned courtyard. Soft morning light fell across his features, highlighting the angles of his face. He looked both stronger and more fragile than ever. When he turned his head to see her, a faint smile touched his lips. "Hey," he managed, the single syllable still shaky but clearer than before. She smiled back, a warmth unfurling in her chest. "Hey," she replied gently. Stepping over to his bedside, she was about to inquire about his comfort when the door opened, revealing Cassandra yet again. The older woman wore an icy expression that made Clara's heart sink. Cassandra pinned Clara with a pointed look. "We need to talk, now." Steeling herself, Clara nodded and gently squeezed Elias's hand before stepping out into the hallway. The door closed, leaving Elias inside, his eyes wide with concern. Cassandra wasted no time, her voice cutting through the corridor's hush like a blade. "I've noticed how you hover over my son, Nurse Mendez," she said, crossing her arms. "And while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I'm not blind. I see the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him." Clara's stomach twisted. She began to speak, but Cassandra held up a manicured hand. "Before you protest, understand that I'm not insensitive. My son has been through a lot. He's vulnerable, and people in vulnerable states often form attachments. But you are an employee. Your job is to care for Elias medically." She paused, her gaze hardening. "I worry about your motives. Do you understand the power my son wields, the wealth, the influence? I won't allow him to be taken advantage of. He's hardly had time to recover. He might mistake gratitude for something else." Hot embarrassment and anger rose in Clara's cheeks. "Mrs. Harrington, with all due respect, I have never once considered taking advantage of your son," she said, keeping her tone even. "My concern for him is genuine." "Genuine," Cassandra repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. She took a step closer, as if trying to physically intimidate Clara. "I've already spoken to the hospital administrators. I have the power to request a reassignment of staff. I expect you to conduct yourself professionally with no illusions of further involvement." Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to show weakness. "Elias is my patient. I'm doing my duty. He and I have been through a lot. He's shared things with me, emotionally, that have helped his recovery." Cassandra's nostrils flared. "Nonsense. The only thing that has helped his recovery is modern medicine and the prayers of his family." She paused, then spoke in a softer but no less forceful tone. "If you truly care for him, don't burden him with complications he can't handle right now." With that, Cassandra turned sharply and re-entered the room, closing the door behind her. Clara stood alone in the corridor, heart pounding, tears burning her eyes. She had seen a flash of vulnerability in Cassandra's warning, though. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about a mother terrified of losing her son again, clinging to control in whatever way she could. Still, Clara knew that even if part of her feelings were purely human compassion, another part ran deeper, nearing the boundaries of genuine affection. She inhaled shakily, then wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. She wouldn't abandon Elias now. Yet, a seed of doubt had been planted. Was she doing more harm than good by staying close to him? Could her presence, her feelings, truly disrupt his path to recovery? For the rest of the shift, Clara remained quiet. She checked on Elias only when necessary, avoiding prolonged conversations in front of Cassandra. But every time she locked eyes with him, she felt a pang in her chest, wondering if the intangible bond they shared was already slipping out of reach. A week drifted by, marked by incremental improvements in Elias's condition. He regained more strength in his arms and could now sit upright without help, though walking was still a distant goal. His voice, while still raspy, grew clearer by the day, allowing him to speak in short, deliberate sentences. During his physical therapy sessions, he sometimes looked for Clara in the hallway, as though her encouragement was an unspoken requirement for his progress. Yet, Clara found herself torn. She knew her care was making a difference, but Cassandra's words haunted her. Each time she stepped into the room, she could sense the older woman's eyes on her, vigilant, as though waiting for any sign of impropriety. Their unspoken truce felt fragile, held in place only because Elias needed uninterrupted therapy. One afternoon, Clara was assisting a different patient on the same floor when she glanced up and saw Elias standing in the hallway, shaky but determined, leaning on a walking aid with the assistance of a physical therapist. Even with his obvious discomfort, a faint grin lit his face when he recognized her. Clara excused herself briefly, heart pounding. As she approached, Elias mustered a soft greeting. "Clara," he said, slow and deliberate. "Needed to walk." Her eyes shone with a mix of pride and concern. "You're doing great," she replied. She and the therapist guided him a few more steps until it was clear he'd reached his limit. "Back to bed?" he asked, breathing heavily. She nodded, helping maneuver him into a wheelchair the therapist had brought along. As they headed back to his room, Elias kept his gaze fixed on her. There was so much he wanted to say. She could see it in his eyes. Once inside, Cassandra was waiting, tapping her foot lightly. Her expression cleared when she saw them, replaced by guarded relief that he was making progress. She hardly acknowledged Clara, instead focusing on Elias. "How do you feel? Do you need more water? A break?" He managed to whisper. "I'm fine." Glancing sideways at Clara, he added, "I'd like to talk to Clara alone." Cassandra stiffened. For a moment it seemed she would argue, but with a tight nod she gestured for the physical therapist to leave with her. Once they were gone, Clara noticed a look of quiet determination in Elias's face. "Clara," he said, struggling but persevering to speak in clearer phrases. "Thank you for everything." He paused to gather energy for the next words. "You saved my life." Her throat tightened. "I just did my job, Elias," she replied softly. He shook his head, face contorting with the effort to speak more fluidly. "No, more than that." He lifted a hand, still weak, and reached toward hers. She hesitated only a second before letting him touch her fingers. The warmth of his skin was startlingly real, a vivid reminder of how far he had come. Behind his eyes flickered a yearning to say something deeper, but words failed him, and the tenderness in his gaze said it all. Clara felt her heart tremble, uncertain and exhilarated in equal measure. Tensions, however, reached a breaking point days later. Cassandra had organized a meeting with a team of specialists right in Elias's room, cluttering the space with white coats, suit jackets, and anxious conversation about the future of his estate and corporate responsibilities. Elias, by then able to form basic sentences, grew visibly agitated as the discussion turned to topics like interim leadership and potential mergers. He tried voicing his discomfort, but the onslaught of medical and business jargon overwhelmed him. Clara, finishing her routine checks just outside the door, overheard the rapid-fire chatter. Sensing Elias's distress, she stepped in and politely suggested that the meeting be relocated to a conference room. "Mr. Kingsley is still in recovery," she said, choosing her words carefully. "He needs a calm environment for healing." In the tense silence that followed, Cassandra's anger surfaced. She dismissed the specialist with a curt nod, then turned on Clara. "This is exactly the problem," she snapped, her voice rising. "Nurse Mendez, you are overstepping your boundaries. You might have been here when Elias was unresponsive, but now that he is awake, I will decide how to handle his affairs." Cassandra's outburst left the room in a hush. Elias, exasperated by his mother's controlling demeanor, made a visible effort to speak. "Mother, stop," he said, each syllable a labor. But his words seemed to ignite her further. "How dare you talk to me like that?" she retorted, turning a furious gaze on him. "Do you know what I've been through since your accident? Your board members hounding me, lawyers drafting endless documents. Don't you realize I'm trying to protect you?" Her voice cracked, revealing an undercurrent of fear beneath the anger. Clara tried to intervene gently. "Mrs. Harrington, no one doubts your intentions. Elias just needs space to recover at his own pace." Spinning around, Cassandra glared at Clara as though she were a threat to be eliminated. "I warned you to stay in your place," she hissed, pointing an accusatory finger. "But it seems you've decided to play the heroine. Let me make this crystal clear. Elias belongs to a world you cannot possibly comprehend. I won't stand by and watch him fall for—" She caught herself, lips trembling with words too severe to voice in front of her son. Finally, she spat. "You're done here." Elias forced a breath. "Mother, no. Clara." But Cassandra had already grabbed the door handle, holding it open as if summoning someone from the corridor. Within seconds, 2 hospital administrators arrived, clearly apprised of some new order from Cassandra. The tension in the room skyrocketed. One of them, an older man with apologetic eyes, turned to Clara. "I'm sorry, Nurse Mendez. We've been instructed to reassign you to another department immediately." Silence crashed down like a physical weight. Elias's eyes flooded with panic, and Clara's heart constricted. In a state of speechless shock, she looked at the man she had helped bring back from the brink. One final glance at Cassandra's unyielding expression confirmed there would be no compromise here. Clara packed her personal items with trembling hands, tears threatening to spill at any moment. She kept replaying the look in Elias's eyes as she was forced out of the room, anguish, helplessness, and an unspoken plea that stung her heart. She would have fought tooth and nail to stay, but the administrators were clear. The Harrington family had a powerful influence on the hospital board, and Cassandra's request carried immense weight. Word spread quickly among the staff that Clara Mendez had been reassigned. Some colleagues approached her, offering whispered words of support. Others avoided her, not wanting to become entangled in a high-profile drama. Dr. Patel, who had come to respect her dedication, managed to catch her in the corridor. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his face etched with regret. "You did everything right, Clara," he said quietly. "I wish I could do more, but my hands are tied by the politics at play. Remember, your skills and compassion don't go unnoticed." She mustered a tremulous smile before leaving the ward that had been her second home for months. Despite being relocated to a different department, Clara's thoughts never strayed far from Elias. She wondered how he was faring under the tight grip of his mother's supervision. She worried that the fragile progress he had made, both physically and emotionally, would be undermined by unrelenting corporate pressure and a lack of the empathetic environment she had tried to create. Meanwhile, Elias found himself missing Clara more with each passing day. He lacked the physical strength to storm out of bed and demand her return, though he made multiple attempts to object to his mother's interference. Each time he stumbled on words, hampered by his still limited speech, and Cassandra would deflect the matter, insisting it was better this way. But better for whom? In the quiet hours when doctors and family members weren't hovering, Elias stared at the ceiling and recalled the nights Clara had read to him from that old paperback, the warmth in her voice creating a cocoon of comfort in a world defined by machines and silence. He remembered her gentle touch when she changed his bandages or helped him through therapy, the soft, reassuring talks about life outside the hospital's walls. Now the nights felt colder. Another nurse came in, polite but distant, strictly business in her approach. The small personal touches that Clara had sprinkled throughout his daily routine were gone. No more softly played music, no more breezy monologues about her day, no more genuine laughter. Elias's heart ached with a longing he couldn't fully articulate, but he knew it wasn't mere gratitude. It was deeper, a sense of connection that transcended patient-caregiver boundaries. In a rare moment of confrontation, Elias managed to corner his mother in his hospital room, mustering all the clarity he could. "Where is Clara?" he demanded, wincing at the strain of each word. Cassandra's lips thinned and she replied calmly, "She's been reassigned. You have the best medical staff money can buy. That's all you need." Elias shook his head, chest tight with frustration. "No, not the same." His mother's eyes flickered with a flash of guilt, then returned to ice. In the days that followed, Elias sank into a grim silence. His physical recovery continued. He learned to stand on his own for a few seconds at a time, and his speech improved enough to form full sentences, but his spirit seemed drained. Dr. Patel noticed the change in demeanor, urging him to stay motivated, but Elias responded only with half nods and minimal engagement. Word of his mood reached the ears of a few well-placed contacts in Kingsley Innovations, and soon rumors flew. Was Elias slipping back into a decline? Did the stress of potential corporate upheaval wear him down? Cassandra tried her best to orchestrate a positive narrative. She arranged for media statements claiming Elias was steadily improving and would soon be able to resume some business responsibilities. She even set up a small press event inside the hospital to showcase his progress, but Elias barely spoke, and the cameras captured only a shadow of his usual commanding presence. The entire charade felt hollow to him. Meanwhile, across the city, Clara began to piece her life together in a new unit at Highgrove, pediatrics, a realm filled with the high-pitched giggles and cries of children rather than the subdued hush of the critical care ward. It was both refreshing and heartbreakingly different. While she adored working with kids, a part of her couldn't stop picturing Elias alone in his room, feeling abandoned. She hoped he was adjusting to new caregivers, but she also feared what his mother's relentless control might be doing to him. Late one evening while finishing her shift, Clara's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen to see an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. A voice crackled on the other end, hesitant and raspy. Clara? Her heart seized at the familiarity of that voice, even though it sounded weaker through the phone. Elias? She breathed, stepping into a vacant corner for privacy. A soft sigh of relief came through. Yes, I had to call you, he managed. Found your number, on old chart. The effort to speak was evident, but the determination behind it was undeniable. Tears sprang to Clara's eyes. How are you? Are you all right? Does your mother know you're calling? She asked the questions in rapid succession, overwhelmed by a rush of worry and joy. He paused, voice wavering. Wanted to hear your voice. A cough interrupted him. After a moment, he continued. Miss you. Clara closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. She felt a surge of conflicting emotions, elation that he had reached out, dread at the notion of crossing Cassandra's wrath. I miss you too, she whispered. Then a nurse's voice in the background demanded to know what Elias was doing. The call abruptly ended. Standing there in the pediatric hallway, the phone still in her hand, Clara realized that whatever was between them wasn't going away. No matter how much Cassandra tried to keep her away, fate, or perhaps something stronger, kept pulling them together. A week later, the situation reached a dramatic climax. Unbeknownst to Cassandra, Elias arranged a small press gathering in the hospital's courtyard, ostensibly to provide an official update on his recovery and quell rumors. With the help of a supportive board member and the discreet assistance of an old friend, he managed to prepare a brief statement. The day of the event, journalists milled around, expecting nothing more than a controlled PR stunt. Cassandra arrived last, her expression betraying mounting anxiety as she scanned the crowd for signs of anything unexpected. Standing behind a podium, Elias gripped the edges for support. He had shed the hospital gown for a tailored blazer that hung a bit loose on his still recovering frame, but it lent him an air of dignity. Microphones were set up, cameras rolling, and the hush that fell over the group spoke volumes. He cleared his throat, his voice raspy yet determined. Thank you for coming, he began slowly, each word enunciated with deliberate care. I appreciate your concern about my health and the company. A camera flash went off, capturing his resolute stare. Cassandra hovered a few steps behind him, arms crossed tightly, her teeth subtly biting her lower lip. After a few formalities about Kingsley Innovations, how he planned to gradually reassume certain responsibilities, Elias's eyes flickered to the side of the courtyard, where Clara stood in scrubs, having just come off a pediatric shift. She had been alerted by a text from a friend in the ward that Elias was making a public statement and might have something crucial to say. Heart pounding, she had slipped into the background of the gathering, uncertain what to expect. Elias continued, voice trembling slightly. There's another reason I asked everyone here. The cameras turned back to him, the assembled reporters leaning in. While I was in a coma, a nurse became my lifeline. Cassandra's eyebrows shot up, and a wave of uneasy whispers coursed through the crowd. Her name is Clara Mendez, he said, glancing around until his eyes found her. She believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Clara felt her heart seize, a flush creeping up her cheeks. She wanted to slip away, but she couldn't tear her gaze from Elias. She stayed by my side, he continued. Read to me, talked to me, cared for me, like I was human, not just a patient. Another flash of camera lights ensued. Cassandra's face turned stony, and murmurs among the media folk turned into excited chatter. Elias steadied himself, taking a slow breath. I owe my life to her. His tone softened, words carrying a depth of feeling impossible to miss. And I want everyone to know that no matter how much time or money we pour into medicines and machines, human compassion is what truly heals. Clara, if you're here, thank you. Silence fell. Then the crowd erupted in a frenzy of questions, camera shutters clicking. Cassandra stepped forward, trying to regain control of the narrative by reminding reporters that Elias's condition was still fragile. But the moment had already crystallized into something unstoppable. A tide of emotions swept through the courtyard. That was when Elias, leaning heavily on a metal crutch, turned in Clara's direction. Their eyes locked, and she felt a tear slip free. Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara stepped out of the shadows. The media parted like a wave, letting her pass until she stood just feet away from the podium. She could hardly breathe, heart hammering with equal parts terror and exhilaration. Elias extended a trembling hand, palm up, inviting her closer. Without a second thought, Clara moved to his side, ignoring the cameras and the frantic gestures of Cassandra. For a moment, the world shrank to just them, the patient she had believed in, and the nurse who had refused to give up. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his skin, and the slight tremor still running through his recovering muscles. "Clara," he rasped, fighting to steady his voice. "I want you in my life, not just as a nurse, but as the person who saved me." A hush fell over the crowd, punctuated only by the faint buzzing of microphones. Clara couldn't find her voice, so she nodded, tears streaming freely now. A ripple of applause broke out, and journalists, sensing an unforgettable human interest angle, clamored for comment. Cassandra, looking both furious and cornered, had no choice but to stand aside in that defining moment. In the days that followed, Clara was reinstated to Elias's care upon his explicit request, but the circumstances had changed. She was no longer simply Nurse Mendez to him. Their bond, forged in the quiet corners of room 514 and tested by corporate machinations and family tensions, stood on a new foundation of mutual respect and affection. While Cassandra might never fully approve of Clara, she could no longer deny the reality of her son's choice. Elias eventually left the hospital. He continued months of rehabilitation, with Clara at his side, this time away from the glare of the media and the controlling oversight of high-powered legal teams. Little by little, he reclaimed his independence, learning to walk without support, speaking with renewed confidence, and even taking back the reins of Kingsley Innovations in a more balanced, compassionate way. Through every hurdle, Clara was there, offering not just medical guidance but a shared dream that extended beyond the walls of Highgrove. What began as the unlikeliest nurse-patient relationship blossomed into something extraordinary. For Elias, it was a chance to realize that wealth and status couldn't cure a lonely heart. For Clara, it was proof that unwavering compassion had the power to break through even the deepest despair. And for both of them, it was a new chapter, a life they chose to build together, hand in hand, filled with hope they once thought impossible.